Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share cryptids encounter stories. First story. This story was shared by you/darkkarma_1994. Central Michigan Camping Horror. I have always loved camping. There is something about being out in a tent away from electronics and everyday life that gives me a sort of reminder that I'm not totally dependent on civilization and phones to survive. I know that not bringing my phone is where I made my biggest mistake, but hey. It's Michigan. We don't have scary predators here that cause me to worry, and I knew these particular woods very well. Never experienced anything bad before, so I figured it was as safe of a place to be. It was my younger brother Todd, my sister Amy and her husband Don and me. All of us agreed no phones, just tents, beer and a relaxing time away from life. Well, I thought it was going to be relaxing. You can choose to believe what you will, but this did happen and my life is never going to be the same. We all rode together in my sister's van and parked at the site we used to party at as teenagers. Even camped here a few times, but had about 5 more people with us. Ugh. The spider spot, really? Amy complained. When we first found this spot years before, there was an old stump that was littered with wolf spiders. We burned it to the ground after waking up to big nasty spiders all over us after a night of drinking. So we named it the spider spot. Come on, that stump's gone, besides it's only a quarter-mile walk and my feet have been killing me from work. Todd sighed. We all grabbed our shit and started walking the 10 to 15 minute walk, looking forward to the fire and, of course, beer. The worst part of the walk was the damn broken branches that seemed to jump out just to stab your face and break off. After we finally got there, we did the usual, setting tents up and grabbed firewood so the rest of the night would be filled with beer, laughter, then bed after about 25 creepy nighttime pissing trips. It must have been around 1:30 a.m. when things started getting weird. Hey, did you guys hear that? Don asked, shushing everyone. We sat quietly and after a few seconds heard the unmistakable sound of laughter. Just some other campers, man, probably doing the same thing we are. I answered with a laugh. Without warning, Todd shouted loudly to the people. Got any more beer? We all laughed and shushed him. We were having a blast and didn't think anything of it. Then we heard running. What the hell, Todd, you pissed them off? Amy started to panic a little. Don't worry, Amy, they are probably drunk just wanting to talk. Don comforted her, but you could see the worried look on his face as the footsteps got closer. My heart was beating out of my chest, thinking we were going to get into a drunken brawl. Got any more beer? It sounded like a weird recording of Todd, only different. What the fuck? All of the hair on my arms stood on end. It really creeped me out. Very funny assholes, Todd shouted. Then more running footsteps, only this time away from our campsite. Must be drunk teenagers messing with us. Amy breathed a sigh of relief. We all kind of nodded and agreed it was time for bed. That was kind of a buzzkill and I think creeped us out a little. Hey, I'm sleeping in your tent, bud, Todd said, kind of with a nervous glance around the darkness. Pussy, I said with a laugh, but was secretly happy not to have to rough it out alone. Once we all were in our tents, it was very quiet. It was the only time I can remember being kind of scared. I must have dozed off because I woke up to Todd shaking me. Dude, listen, he whispered quietly. At first there was nothing. Then I heard the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. It sounded right outside my tent like a foot away. "I'm sleeping in your tent tonight, bud." Again it sounded like Todd, only not like him. I was about to shit my pants. Todd looked at me in horror, and I must have had the same look on my face because I was petrified. Then we heard the running again, and whatever it was, it ran off again. "Let's hurry, get the fuck out of here," Don shouted to my surprise. They must have been listening to whatever it was too. We all jumped out of our tents and ran back to the van as quick as possible. I've never felt more relieved to be out of the woods. This was all last weekend and is 100% true. The worst part is Todd called me and said he's been hearing something outside his house at night. He wants me to come over tonight, but I'm honestly afraid too. Second story. This story was shared by you/My Morning Mojito. Something absolutely malevolent exists in rural Montana. The jump scares, the monster under the bed, your friend dressed up as a man with a knife, these are all pretty damn scary. But I consider these temporary and/or mild scares, scares that aren't slow. Oftentimes, it's a harmless scene from a movie or a friend pulling a prank on you that elicits a 5-second shriek. True fear, a pervasive fear that slowly eats away at your conscience, comes out of the unknown. The feeling that deep in the depths of darkness, something is going to take you away, that something is lurking in the shadows. It's the feeling that any second, you could be dead, the feeling that a pair of beady eyes are staring right at you, but you can't stare back. My journey began in Montana. It was a November night in 2004, and I was en route to Calgary, Canada. My family comes from Canada, and I was making the drive from my home in Billings to Calgary. The main highways were shutting down in preparation for a snowstorm, and few dared to drive out in the impending snowstorm. Me, I was a cocky 20-year-old who didn't give a damn. I figured, I was born in Canada, I drive a F-150, I can handle some snowy roads. Rural Montana is eerie at night, especially the back roads. The main route from Kalispell to Lethbridge, Canada, was closed, and I was forced to take a back route, a seemingly endless 2-lane road that probably hadn't been worked on in decades. I remember turning my turn signal on, and heading north on that road. It was about 11 p.m., and the snow showers were beginning to turn into a windy, snowy mess, with my windshield wipers just barely clearing off the falling snow. I wasn't worried about the weather, nor the ice coating the 2-laned road, nor the health of my mother. No, I was preoccupied with the feeling that something was behind me. See, the road was entirely straight, and cut through a dense pine forest. The road was devoid of any curves, turns, or signs, it was merely a 50-mile-long straight shot through a dense forest. Straight. Endless. My brights only exposed the sheer desolation, the isolation of the environment in which I was in. I hadn't seen an automobile in half an hour. I felt exposed yet utterly alone at the same time. To calm my nerves, I inserted a Toby Keith CD into my radio and cranked the volume up. The soothing sound of country guitar was beginning to relax me, it was alleviating the feeling of unease. About a minute into the song, the track became jumbled. The guitar solo was abruptly interrupted by scratchy sounds. It was akin to nail on a chalkboard, it was absolutely unbearable. As I adjusted the volume, my F-150 lost traction on the ice, and within seconds, I found my car coming to a screeching halt, my hood trapped in a large snow bank approximately 20 feet off the side of the road. "Fuck," I screamed. I turned on my hazards and proceeded to curse like a sailor as I stepped out of the car and into the snowy landscape. The blizzard hindered the visibility to the point where I could hardly see feet in front of me. A ferocious icy wind was burning my face, and the feeling of unease only grew. I threw on an extra parka, and turned my car off. That's when I heard his voice. "Adam," he said. "Adam?" It was a voice that absolutely sent shivers up my spine, a voice that caused me to tense up like a marble statue. It was the voice of my father. "Adam, is that you?" I gulped and could barely breathe. My father was a park ranger in Banff, and then at Glacier National Park when we moved to America. When I was 10 years old, he got lost in a snowstorm, and was never heard from again. His body was never found, and while the police searched for weeks, he was eventually declared dead. I didn't have time to draw parallels between my situation and his situation, and I let emotion overtake me. "Dad?" I continued, "Dad, I can't see you." "I can see you just fine," it said. "Come a little closer." I froze. The seconds of emotions and adrenaline had abruptly come to a halt. I'm a rational man. My father was dead, he had been dead for 10 years. Something else was going on. "Adam," did I stutter, "come with me," it said. "Come with me. It's nice and warm where I stand, come with me." I still couldn't see whatever the fuck was speaking, and I had no time to play games. I hopped in my car and started the ignition. The damn thing wouldn't start. "Adam, your car won't start, it's futile," it said. The voice was distorted this time, it sounded as if my father had the flu, a real deep, raspy voice. Despite the freezing cold, I could feel nervous sweat dripping from my brow. The slow scare I mentioned was sinking in. I couldn't think, my hands shook relentlessly as I tried to start the car. Against my better judgment, I stepped out the pickup truck, and ran the opposite direction. I had never run faster in my life, the only force keeping my ass from running out of breath was pure fear and adrenaline. Behind me I heard it calling my name, its voice becoming more distorted each second. "Adam! Adam! Adam!" Within minutes, as the snow relentlessly beat down on me, and as the moon became shrouded by pine trees and snow, I found myself in the middle of a pine forest. Lost. Lost completely. Its voice, however, was slowly disappearing. As it faded into the night, so did my consciousness. The cold had gotten to me, and I hadn't realized it. Before I drifted to an unconscious sleep, I slowly put two and two together. It's November, my dad, November, snowstorm, lost forever. Those were my final thoughts before waking up in a Great Falls hospital. Surrounded by doctors, I glanced around me. I was dizzy and dozed in and out of consciousness before finally waking up. I drew a comparison between what happened to my father when I was 10, and the near death I had avoided. I shivered. After minutes of recuperating, the doctor beside my bed explained what had happened. "Mr. Redacted, you are a lucky, lucky man. You were found unconscious 200 yards away from a country road. Your body temperature was 88 F. I'm amazed that you seemingly won't suffer any long-term effects." "Who found me?" I asked, completely dazed, still recalling the thing that had chased me. "Some man driving to Missoula saw your Ford deep in the trees off the side of the road, your hazards reflecting some light. Minutes later, he heard groaning, and found your motionless body in the snow." The doctor continued, I only have one real question before I let you rest and talk to your mother. What drove you to leave your automobile and run into a pine forest, in the middle of a snowstorm?" He coughed and chuckled as he said, "I mean, come on, what happened? Did you see a ghost?" As he laughed at his corny joke, I thought to myself, I wish I had seen it. Third story. This story was shared scribbled Corvid. My farm is haunted. I've spent almost my entire life on the family farm. We've always been the first to adopt modern equipment and farming techniques, and I was the first in the family to attend college. Needless to say, I studied agricultural science. My skills save us a lot by not having to hire outside experience. Things have always been kind of weird in the region. Some say our wheat fields were plowed in over an ancient burial ground, and others say that a witch cursed the local region before being drowned in the local lake that we get our irrigation water from. What I do know is that things seem to be growing weirder ever since my grandfather was forced to retire and move to town. I would like to visit him more, but there's always something new to do. Things break down, and livestock get spooked. Things do seem to be easier when I bring Betsy with me. Betsy is grandfather's favorite shotgun, which he passed down to me before having to move into the home. My parents are out of the picture for the next year. They're taking an around-the-world cruise for their 30th anniversary. It's not easy to contact them. International phone calls are expensive, and they are limited in time when out at sea. Some of the workers are spooked too and refuse to spend the night on the property despite having access to spare houses for far cheaper rent than they pay in town. Not that I blame them. I spent the night in one of the houses since it was close to where I had to work late and get up early for a job, working on a broken irrigation pump. That night I slept poorly as I heard all kinds of strange sounds. Most would say it's probably an animal, and I would say the same if I did not hear it myself. I know what the local wildlife sounds like, and this was not that. It sounded like the Nazgul scream out of the Lord of the Rings movies. We're a high-tech farm and I've got plenty of cameras for monitoring. I went through the footage and got nothing but weird shadows and glitches on half the cameras. The other half were battery operated and were dead. Not usual, but also not unusual considering the quality of lithium batteries out of China these days. After I fixed the pump, I went out with Betsy and swapped in fresh batteries from a good brand and made a note to throw the bad ones in the battery recycling bin the next time I was in town. Things seemed to change for a while. The strange sound stopped, and all the cameras were working normally with no glitches or other failures. The good times didn't last. Things started to quickly get weird again a few days later. I'm hearing strange sounds. The workers are also hearing strange sounds while working in some of the more distant fields. The livestock are all spooked. Sometimes the workers report seeing shadows out of the corners of their eyes and are easily spooked. I've seen the same shadows. They resemble some kind of creature that doesn't belong in nature. Some of the families who decided that farming was not for them but still like the great outdoors have become park rangers and timber workers. Some of the stories they have shared at gatherings remind me of what I'm dealing with now. Their stories about strange creatures of the night, mysterious staircases, and the like sounded far-fetched at the time, but maybe I should contact some of them for a bit of help. If it's something spooky, they might have the experience, and if it's more mundane, then we have a chance to hang out and shoot some beers and maybe some targets. Honestly, looking back, I think this all started when we bought out the Kane farm. They had been doing bad for years. We never really hung out with their kids. They were weird and not in a fun way. A school rumor went around saying that one of their kids drowned another. Other rumors say that one of the kids tried to burn down the bar. All I know is that they were in and out of school. Grandfather did something with some of his older friends, something he never told me about, only that the matter was settled any time that I asked. I fear that with him off, the property ever happened has come undone, but Betsy's presence offers reassurance and hope. I read some online forums and discovered that sometimes supernatural entities like spirits can change the temperature of an area or even show up on infrared cameras, so I ordered a bunch of smart farming sensors to monitor the ambient temperature, pressure and humidity levels and the temperature and moisture content of the fields. I even installed some thermal surveillance cameras in places where workers reported seeing the strange shadows the most. These cameras also work in the dark to show if people are trespassing. The data from the sensors made no sense. Weird temperature drops that seemed random until I plotted the data on a map of the farm. I could see that things were moving around at night, and even during the day, causing local temperature drops. I filled in gaps with more sensors to better track the mystery and repointed some cameras. These cameras showed mysterious shadows and glitches at the same time the sensors reported drops in temperatures. Some even caught videos of strange floating orbs. Of course, I'm freaked out now. Something strange is going on, and if the data is correct, it's starting at the old cane farm and slowly spreading into the rest of the property. I've read that inviting the supernatural into your home is granting permission for them to have a wild party. Did we inadvertently do that by integrating the cane property into our own? Is what caused their madness now infecting me? I tried to call my grandfather, but he said that he couldn't talk over the phone about that. He'd talk to me in person but did not want to risk sounding crazy enough to end up in the dementia ward. I fully understand his concern. I'm worried about ending up in the psych ward if I talk about this to the wrong person. Things started getting more intense as the staff reported that they felt like they were being watched, and not by the cameras that they used as much as I did for their work. They even noticed the shadows and glitches. It all came to a head when one of the staff working alone on the old cane block was attacked. They managed to radio in for help, and we called an ambulance while rushing over all armed. The beast had him trapped up a tree. It's like something I've never seen before. It was some strange furless beast covered in scales like a blend of a dog and a giant lizard. Saul swore it was a chupacabra. We all fired at it and our shots did nothing. We were panicking as it started to approach us. I remembered that Betsy warded off the entities before, ran to my truck, and grabbed Betsy, which was loaded with slugs. The first shot missed the creature, but the second shot hit true and did massive damage. The third shot finished off the wounded creature. Strangely, the beast didn't die like a normal coyote or wolf. It seemed to dissolve into oily shadows that faded from existence. We were all shocked to see that it faded from existence. Jack, one of my longtime friends turned employee, suggested that we go into town and get the pastor to come out and bless the place. Saul suggested that we call his church and ask for the priest to come out and perform an exorcism. When the emergency services arrived, the injured employee was loaded up on an ambulance and taken back to town. We told the police that it was a coyote that ran back into the forest, frightened by the rest of us arriving. If we told the truth, we'd be laughed at or worse, locked up for discharging firearms while drunk. That night we went to my grandparents' old house. One of the few places that the entities seemed to avoid. Our map data of their movements told us this. They also said that multiple entities had converged on the main road out of the property. We all felt better even as we lit the old fireplace and got to chatting. After a while, our conversations turned to talking about what we encountered and what could be stalking the farm. We discussed if it could be demons or devils, the jinn, yokai, or even Wendigo. The next day things calmed down. None of our sensors or cameras reported any anomalies. All the crew went back to town that night, leaving only myself on the farm. It was another quiet night. Seems like that activity drained the energy of whatever was haunting the farm. The one strange thing was a storm warning for the area that night despite no long-term storm predictions. I wasn't too worried. Every farmer knows that the weatherman can get it wrong. Despite the weirdness seeming to be reduced, I did notice things to be very quiet. Most of the bird life seems to have vanished, leaving behind a few flocks of corvids, and even the flocks of crows and ravens are huddled tightly, wary about something. I was worried that it could be something to do with the supernatural, but more likely they're making their own preparations for the storm. I called one of my brothers who is a park ranger at one of those national parks known as a hotspot for missing persons and rumored to be haunted by some of the entities I discussed with the workers. I shared my findings and even some of the discussions with my workers with him. Luckily one of the workers got a picture of the beast. As I talked to my brother, the predicted storm rolled in, flashes of lightning illuminating the windows. I spot the weird shadows again in the lightning flashes, but figure that it's just the flash overwhelming my eyes since everything was so calm. He grew more alarmed the more I told him on receiving a copy of the photo that he'd take a few days of emergency leave from work and be bringing a coworker with him. He sent me a phone number for a government department that I had never heard of before. The Bureau of the Occult. After I hang up on my brother, I check on the cameras and sensors. Some of them are down, likely due to lightning strikes and trees falling on cables. I'm not too worried. Cameras and sensors can be replaced in the morning. I do notice that the cloud backup hasn't run since I started installing the extra sensors and sigh in frustration. I plug in a portable disk and start the backup process before calling the bureau on the number that was given to me. I'm greeted by a professional voice, and after I explain my situation, I'm told that my brother opened a case on my behalf. The bureau did request that I send them all my data, and I agreed to email it to them. I wrote up an email on my laptop with the details of when I first started to notice the weirdness. The contact details of my grandfather, who knows more details including remote access credentials and the different accounts for the different software I use on my farm server that runs all the data gathering and analytics. I don't store it all on my laptop, I've got a dedicated server for that. Moments after I sent the email, I was both blinded and deafened by a nearby lightning strike that hit the power pole for the house. The force of the lightning strike makes the pole transformer explode in a shower of sparks. I grab Betsy and run over to the server that runs my monitoring infrastructure, only to find flames coming out of the power supply. I pull the hot swap solid-state drives only to find the chips physically blown. I groan in frustration. This bureau, if they are real, will think it's a hoax. The portable backup drive seems to be intact and cool to the touch, so I grab that, hoping that an archive of the data is on there, then grab Betsy. With the power out to the house, it's not safe to stay. I don't trust shadows or darkness, and I doubt I'd have enough batteries for my flashlight collection to last the night. I spot the lights on in my grandparents' house and then remember that Saul was going to spend the night on the property so he could get an early start. I quickly called him to let him know that the power was out in my house after the transformer took a lightning strike, and he agreed to use a spotlight light the way for me. I load the drive and my laptop into a bag with some boxes of shotgun shells. I wear a flashlight on my head, attach another to Betsy and make my way out into the darkness outside. It's cold and rainy outside. The ground is muddy. I make my way to my grandparents' house and find that shadows are swirling around in the wind. Sometimes the shadows group up around something like a tree or fence only for it to fall over or get struck by lightning. The shadows make their way towards me, and I find myself wielding Betsy to drive them off. Just pointing light at them seems to deter them. Saul spots the same and uses his spotlight to help drive the shadows away from me. He's well lit by my grandparents' house. It's got a generator with plenty of fuel, so it's a perfect safe haven. I run over to the house as fast as I can but slip in the mud. I look up and spot what seems to be some kind of enormous bird lit up by a bright flash of lightning. I scramble the rest of the way to my grandparents' house and hear a clap of thunder that sounds almost like a cry of frustration. Once in the light, I immediately feel safe. Saul grabs my hand and leads me inside. Once inside, he tells me that he spotted the same strange bird in the storm. If whatever is haunting the farm is strong enough to summon that, I have no idea what to do. Maybe my brother and this mysterious bureau of the occult can help. All I know is that help will arrive in the morning and that I need to hold out until then. I've got Saul as backup, my grandparents' home as a safe spot, and a gun safe that might hold more special guns like Betsy's. The data could be wiped, or I might have a copy of enough. All I know is that tomorrow will be a better day, and until then Saul and I will take turns sharing guard duty and sleep. Fourth story. This story was shared by you/Colin7HeKid. I think I may have seen a Wendigo. So this is very confusing, but bear with me. I was in my house with tea and a book. I have a large window seat on the second floor, and I was chilling right there. I have a small 2-story cabin in the woods. A long driveway, about a half mile, leads down to the main road, not a highway, mind you. I enjoy taking hikes, hunting, fishing, and just enjoying nature in general. I was looking out into the forest to see if I could find any cool birds, when I heard a noise. A rustle in the bushes brought my attention toward my neighbor's cattle pen. My neighbor's house can only be accessed by the same long road, and they have a farm with 3 cattle, 2 cows and a bull, 12 chickens, and 2 pigs. A large barn sits in the middle of all the pens. The bush rustled again. Thinking it was a bear, I was worried it would take one of the pigs, and drag them into the woods. This has happened once already, sadly. I grabbed my old hunting rifle. I was going to attempt to fire the gun in the air and scare the creature, no reason to harm it. But what I saw made me think twice. I walked out onto my large back porch, fired in the air. The loud noise pierced my eardrums, and chased me to flinch. The second the rifle fired, a dull reddish blur appeared, sprinting into the neighbor's pig pen. It got on all fours, and grabbed the poor animal with its mouth, then sprinted back into the forest, with the swine clutched between its jaws. Holy shit! I yell, after seeing this. This is where it gets really bad. I sprint to my neighbor's house, gun in hand, waiting to tell him about the grisly abduction I just witnessed. I stopped about 50 feet from the house when I noticed the glass slider door was ajar, and a thick path of blood led from there to the barn. I didn't notice this before, because you can't see either the house or the barn from my house. It's covered in trees. The pig and cattle pens are right near the woods on their backyard, but the tree grove stops, so you can see them. Scared crapless, I tentatively followed the trail. When I reached the inside of the barn, I already knew what I would find, two skeletons lie in a haystack. Both were white, and picked clean. Yelling bloody murder, I ran back to my house. I locked myself inside with my gun. Pelting rain and hail started coming down. Before the power went out, I watched the news channel, and apparently this storm would go on for 3 days, and it was a big one. Thunder and lightning crashed, and I tried to call the police, news channel blaring in the background. No service. Then the TV cut out. I went to bed, and locked every door and window, grabbed my bow as well as my gun, and my hunting knife. I finally made it through morning. I'm surprised I slept at all. When I woke up, I noticed something gleaming in the dirt of the pig pen, through the pelting rain. A bone-white skeleton, and the other pig was missing. Blood adorned the trees and fence near the pen. I'm typing this on my phone, which is at 20% plus I have no way to charge it. Does anyone know what this thing is? I need help. I will update tomorrow hopefully, if I conserve phone battery, and I'm not dead by then. Fifth story. This story was shared by you/EternalChaw0s. Wendigo Dream. Hello there. I think I dreamed about a Wendigo. Sorry in advance for butchering your language. English is my third language. It was not a bad dream. It was the most beautiful dream I've ever had. The dream really messed with me, so that's the reason why I am writing this. So, here it goes. I was chosen by a group of people to help them perform a ritual in a forest because apparently I have some gift that they also share. The group consisted of around 6 to 7 people. I remember a kind elderly lady, a rude middle-aged man, someone else who is now just a blur, 2 young girls around the ages of 9 to 12, and a kind blonde man sitting next to me, explaining the ritual. The ritual itself was what you'd expect from a dream ritual to be. Weird. We sat cross-legged in a circle. We all wore beige clothing that resembled hemp clothing. There was a black pot in the middle of the circle with a ladle next to it. Inside the pot was water, cooked rice, and chunks of raw meat. Our task was to first pour the water on our arms, elbow to wrist, and then fish out only the rice, avoiding all meat and sticking it to the place we poured the water on. Once everyone did that, the elderly lady chanted some gibberish and fell silent. A few moments later a loud hum, like a vibration, started going off all around us in repeating intervals of like 2 to 3 seconds. The ritual was successful. The 2 girls got up and started dancing out of joy. This is where it gets really surreal. A fairly tall pine tree near us started bending, curving towards us, so that the top of it almost touched our heads. The vibration was still going on. Everyone around me was happy that something was coming and happening. I looked at my arm where I spread the cooked rice, and it was in full bloom. My arm was covered in blooming plant life. It was beautiful and I felt really happy. I then looked up, and in an opening behind the elderly lady there was a young deer that quickly jumped out of view, and a rabbit with red/brown fur staring right at me. After a while it too jumped out of view. The vibration was still going off until I felt something touch my shoulder. At that point, everything stopped. The exact moment it touched me I knew how it looked like and what it wanted to tell me. It was about 2 m tall. It had a deer skull with long antlers. I think it had some remains of a vest of some kind around its chest area. That part is a bit blurry, but what isn't is the fact that it had long black fur that covered its entire body and long arms. I felt Mother Nature in it. All of nature and life was concentrated in that being that gently put its hand on my shoulder. I was not scared. In fact, I felt loved by it. Like I too, belong to nature and I am part of that being. Then the dream ended. Now, why did I write this? Well, for starters, the dream felt extremely real. Like nothing I have ever experienced in my 28 years on this planet. I felt the heat of the water and rice on my hand, the sound and words from the people were crystal clear. I felt a forest draft while sitting down with the rest and the touch of the Wendigo on my shoulder. It was a warm touch. Why the dream is fucking with me? Because now I feel drawn to the forest. Every cell in my body is telling me to leave the city life and live my days in a forest and be part of nature. I am from Europe. Central EU. The only time I have heard about Wendigos was when I watched an SCP video on YouTube like 3 to 4 years ago. So it's weird that I even dreamt about it. Since it's supposedly native to the US. Anyways, that's it. That's the weird story. Sixth story. This story was shared not_Luna. My terrifying encounter with a Canadian legend. Spoiler alert, it's not just a legend. Growing up in the remote wilderness of northern Canada, I always heard stories of the Wendigo. My grandfather told me tales of a creature so terrifying that even the bravest of men trembled at the mere mention of its name. But I never truly believed in the legend until one dark, snowy night. The whistling started faintly at first, like a haunting tune carried on the frigid wind. But it grew louder and more insistent, like it was calling out to me personally. I tried to ignore it and kept hiking, but the whistling persisted, creeping closer and closer until I couldn't ignore it any longer. I peered into the darkness beside me and saw a figure standing in the woods. It was tall and thin, with skin stretched tightly over its bones, and its eyes glowed gray with a fierce hunger. I knew instantly what it was, the Wendigo. The instant I noticed it in the woods, it stopped whistling for a moment and twisted its head like it was intrigued that I had given in to its call. It began to whistle again, a melody so haunting that it seemed to penetrate my very soul. It was like it was trying to hypnotize me, to lure me into the woods where it could claim me for its own. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move as it began to creep closer and closer. Its claws and teeth gleamed in the moonlight, and I knew that if it reached me, it would be the end. I turned to continue hiking. I just needed to get back to my cabin, I told myself. But then, it started snarling. The whistling faltered for just a moment as I heard its footsteps thumping through the woods. I grabbed the knife my grandfather gave me as a boy from my bag, ready to strike. When my grandfather gave me this knife, he told me to always keep it close because it might just save my life one day. As soon as I heard the Wendigo break through the tree line, I threw it with all my might. It hit the creature square in the chest, and it let out a blood-curdling scream. It writhed in agony as I watched, frozen with terror. But then, to my horror, it began to change. Its skin began to peel away in strips, revealing a twisted and gnarled form underneath. Its limbs elongated and twisted into new shapes, its jaws unhinged to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth. It was transforming into something even more monstrous than before. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the Wendigo behind me, its ragged breaths and pounding footsteps echoing through the trees. I struggled with all my might to get away, my feet slipping and sliding on the snow and ice. Just as I thought I wouldn't be able to escape, I heard a branch snap behind me. I didn't dare look back, but I felt in my stomach that the creature was still close behind. I pushed myself harder, running as fast as I could. I could see the lights of my cabin in the distance, a beacon of safety in the darkness. With a final burst of adrenaline, I threw myself through the door of my cabin and slammed it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. I could hear the Wendigo outside, snarling and whistling. But my grandfather always told me they couldn't come inside as long as I kept the door locked. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too scared to move. But eventually, the snarling and whistling stopped, and I knew that the creature had moved on. I didn't manage to sleep that night, but hours after the sun came up, I carefully opened the door and went back outside and into the woods. I followed my own footsteps in the snow. The Wendigo's nowhere to be seen, as if it hadn't been stomping into the ground with what sounded like an earth-shattering force. About halfway to where I thought I had first seen the Wendigo, I found a tree. Mangled, split in half and laid out diagonally across the path, I realized this tree was how I was able to get away. Then I thought back to what my grandfather said about the knife. Maybe the knife made the tree get in the way. Maybe not. Either way, I never forgot that night. For years after that night, I lived in constant fear of the Wendigo's return. Every time the wind whistled through the trees, or a stray twig snapped in the woods, I would freeze, waiting for the sound of that haunting melody. 7th story. This story was shared by you/resident, Safe771. My parents went hiking 3 days ago. The search party found their GoPro still recording. It was sudden. We got a call from a nearby city's police station. Our uncle who was taking care of me and my sister while our parents were away answered the phone. We were confused as to why our uncle was crying until we learned the news. Our parents were found dead over 11 miles away from where they started hiking over 3 days ago. I was horrified. I felt as if my world has just splintered into nothing, and my sister just fell to the floor while I just sat there, blank face and warm tears running down my cheeks. The sheriff was obligated to ask us where we wanted the funeral, and other questions. Thankfully my uncle pulled himself together and scheduled his own brother and sister-in-law's funeral by himself. The weeks flew by as the weekend was over and I was left in a well of grief, still processing all that had recently happened. Eventually, we got another call, telling us that another piece of evidence had been found. We initially dismissed it, until they told us that it belonged to our parents. As they told us, the more intrigued we were, until my uncle decided to drive us all down there. After all of us at least wanted to see their faces one more time, since mysteriously, the funeral was closed casket. Once we got there we waited in the waiting room until a man guided us in. They said they had not yet reviewed the footage, and that when they found it, it was covered in blood and still recording even though it was clearly damaged. Finally, we got to a room where they were ready to play the footage, and all of us took a seat before the man who led us in started the video. At first, it was just my parents walking. We fast-forwarded, more walking, some fishing, picking up sticks and skipping rocks. I was simply happy to see my parents again, even if it was just a recording. We went to the next video. My parents were just walking, but looked noticeably tired and anxious. Eventually, while they were resting, my mother broke the silence. "Did you hear any of that last night?" My father responded, "Yeah, it sounded so odd, like it was directly in my ear, but also near a mile away." She gave him an agreeing nod. Eventually they kept walking, not breaking the silence until they camped. "Do you think it will happen again?" my mother asked. My father responded, "It had to have been just some animal. No creature would follow us that far just to make some noises and not do anything to us. But what if it dash?" My mother was cut off. "Just trust me, we'll leave tomorrow and forget any of this happened." My father tried to reassure her. It worked and they went to bed. On the third day though, something was off. My mother no longer had her bright energy accompanying her, and my father seemed to be suffering from sleep deprivation. It felt as though my parents were just husks of their former selves. And more ominous than that, there was a strange, faint background noise constantly playing for the first 3 hours. Then it just stopped. My parents looked around and seemed to sigh and become way more relaxed. Then they stopped for a food break at a small creek. It seemed good, until that noise started back up, and louder than before. This caused notable dread in my parents, as the fear in their eyes was visible. They both ran away, leaving all their food behind, as the noise kept getting louder. Eventually, my mother tripped and her bone-chilling screams could be heard in the background as the noise seemed to stop with her. After 2 hours of non-stop running, my father ended up at our house backyard. I heard him sobbing uncontrollably. He was a mess just by the audio. He started to get it together and approach our house, until the light around him seemed to wash away, like fresh paint in reaction to water. We sat there watching this overwhelming silence and darkness, until it was broken by a faint sound. Then it got louder, and louder, until it felt like my eardrums were about to pop. My father appeared back in the woods, but he was not alone. As he turned, a part of the screen seemed to warp and glitch out. My father looked at it, and started screaming as the thing approached him in the blink of an eye. My father seemed to be screaming as something was inserted into his mouth, then it stopped when the snapping of his bones was heard. The GoPro fell onto the ground, and it filmed my father floating over the glitching part of the screen. Then both of them just seemed to phase out of focus, and into nothingness. I was in shock by what I saw, and so was everyone else in the room with me. My sister was pale, and my uncle looked completely petrified. Finally, the police escorted us out. The drive home was silent, and we all seemed to not dare to speak a word, because, in the silence, we all heard it. The faint sound of the thing that killed my parents, slowly approaching. 8th story. This story was shared by you/So Hungry Throwaway. I killed something unnatural, and I can't stop the hunger. I'm not entirely sure where to start, so I'm going with a brief introduction. My name is Xander. I'm a freelance interior repair guy. I fix the seats, dashboard, and any other interior upholstery in vehicles, and I'm more or less the best in my area. You'd be surprised at the kind of money you can make fixing the car seats of rich people who can't stand the tiniest mark. At the moment, I am taking a 2-month hunting trip out in the middle of nowhere, and something is clearly wrong with me. I've only been in the cabin for a week, and I've eaten a bit more than 2 weeks worth of food so far, and at no point did it really fill my stomach, only stopped the hunger for a few hours. It started on my first day up here. I got my SUV unpacked, fired up the generator and set up the satellite so I could have Wi-Fi and TV, then grabbed my gear and decided to see if I could find anything out by my tree stand. Once I arrived, I made sure my rifle was loaded and ready, Mossberg Patriot .308 bolt action if you're curious, but still had the safety on and pointed at the ground until I saw anything. After about 2 hours the sun was just starting to set, and I'd barely even heard a rustle. My spot was usually pretty active, and I saw plenty of small game, rabbits, ducks, and maybe 1 or 2 fisher cats as the sun set, but not even a flash of a deer running by. I was beginning to think I'd have better luck in the morning, when I heard something akin to a mountain lion scream, followed by what had to be an elk or moose crying out in pain. I've heard plenty of animals cry out after being attacked, but this was different. The scream had too much bass to it, and sounded disturbingly human. After a moment I heard the loudest crunch of bone I've ever heard. it was like the sound of a waterlogged tree breaking in half, and the wounded animal's cries got much louder and more frantic, before being suddenly cut short with another massive crunch. Now, it's worth mentioning this area does not typically have mountain lions, and their attacks do not sound like that. It sounded more like an angry grizzly was tearing something apart, and neither option sounded like something I wanted to see, so I decided to head back to the cabin. I removed the mag from my rifle, popped the one in the chamber back into it, pocketed it, and made sure my dad's old pistol was ready, .44 Magnum Desert Eagle, before walking as quietly as I could down the path. As I moved, I made sure I could still hear whatever was eating, keeping its relative position in my mind. Last thing I wanted to do was come face to face with a predator in the middle of a meal. As I listened, I heard less and less crunching, and more wet chewing. Whatever the thing was, it was finishing up, so I started to pick up the pace, and as I became more conscious of the noise I was making, I realized I couldn't hear any other living thing in the woods, only that predator. That clued me in that whatever it was unnatural. To those who haven't spent much time in nature, you might not know this, but when the woods go quiet, you get going. At best, you've got a predator nearby, and at worst, you're already screwed. I almost started sprinting when I realized this, but instead I simply steadied my breath, turned off the safety on my pistol, but kept my finger off the trigger, and watched my footing carefully. If I trip now, I may as well ring the dinner bell. I could see my cabin in the distance, and I finally started to calm down a bit, before I heard that thing scream again. It sounded like a man who just lost a limb, a scream of pain and fear, but there was still something animalistic about it, something feral. It had to be something big, and possibly rabid based on the amount of noise it was making. I heard the thing start to move around again. At first it was loud, wet footsteps, and then it turned to something akin to a gallop. This thing was sprinting, and based on the increasing volume of it, it was sprinting toward me. I lost my nerve. I started running myself. I could see the cabin, I could see the heavy reinforced door and the barred windows. I just needed to get inside, and I'd be safe. Or at least, that's what I thought until I heard a tree fall not 20 years behind me. It shook the ground as it hit, and I knew without a doubt whatever was chasing me would tear down that door like cardboard. So, I made a stupid decision. I turned around, put my finger on the trigger, and took aim at the center of mass of the things coming towards me. I fired once, and it didn't slow. I fired 2 more times, and it faltered slightly. At that point, I didn't care about well-placed shots, or about conserving ammo. I emptied my magazine into the thing and loaded my spare. It fell over and I moved in, firing every round I had into its head. It started to get up again. I grabbed my rifle off my back, loaded the mag, and repeated the process, aiming for the eyes. Finally, after my third to last shot, it seemed to stop moving. I fired the last 2 into its eye socket to be sure and loaded my spare mag just in case. Finally, I took a moment to recognize what I was looking at, and I threw up immediately. It was human, but it was emaciated, ribs visible, stomach sunken, and limbs lacking muscle definition. It had no hair, its teeth were rotted and sharp, and its mouth was horrifying. Looking down its throat was more like looking down an empty well. It was a black pit that seemed to go down endlessly. What in God's name was this thing? What was wrong with it? What can tackle a tree over while looking starved? Why did I suddenly feel hungry? I got back into the cabin, stripped, and took a long shower. It wasn't until I sat down to eat a meal that it finally occurred to me, that thing took 17 rounds of .44 Magnum, as well as at least 3.308 rounds to the torso and head before finally stopping. You could stop a family of grizzly with that and still have enough to get yourself a deer or two if you aimed well. That thing was screwed up in too many ways to count. I finished my food, and despite the growling of my stomach, decided it was enough for now, and tried to sleep. When I finally fell unconscious, I had horrid dreams of that thing. It chased me down and jumped on me, before laughing and jamming its blood-soaked hand down my throat, and at that moment I jolted awake, my stomach screaming out for more food. I started out by making a few eggs, then some toast, then bacon, then pancakes, and finally I felt, well, not full, but the growling stopped for now. I didn't feel bloated, or weighed down at all like you should after eating about 3 people's worth of food in one sitting. I thought I must have just burned a lot of calories running from and killing that thing, but given that the hunger has stayed the same since then, I have a feeling it's something more insidious. I stepped outside to get a better look at whatever it was I killed, and when I approached the body, I quickly noticed 2 things. 1, there was not a single living thing near it. No ants, no flies, no small scavengers, nothing. No living thing would touch it. Second, it seemed mummified almost, as if it had died in a bog a few hundred years ago. It was clearly decaying in some way, but there was no stink of a corpse, only the same sour body odor it smelled of when it was alive. I could only assume that not even bacteria wanted anything to do with it. I left it alone, and stepped back into the cabin to connect my phone to the satellite so I could try and Google whatever that monster could be, but nothing is really fitting what I'm seeing, and it doesn't really explain my sudden hunger after its death. Does anyone know what it could be? I can only assume it's cursed me or given me some disease that makes me hungry, and I can't keep eating this much. I'll run out of food in a week if I do. Please, does anyone know what could do something like this? 9th story. This story was shared by you/Romanian_roulette. My uncle encountered a thing on my granddad's ranch. I would like to note that this is my uncle's story, not mine. I will also be writing this through my uncle's perspective when the event occurred. Thanks, OP. I guess the whole event took place in the summer of '75. I was about 13. For the story to make sense, I'll start with context. My mother divorced my dad due to his issues with alcoholism, and quickly got custody over me and my 5 siblings. My dad was struggling greatly, so he made what was most likely the best decision, to move to a remote log cabin in Montana. He also had pretty serious mental problems. Because of his problems and the severity of them, my mom decided to never really let us stay at his cabin. She claims that she made a good decision, but I really feel like she accidentally made things worse, just isn't brave enough to own up to it. Anyway, my mother finally decided to let me fly up to my dad's cabin for a week, mostly because she felt like he needed someone in his life. Someone of his own flesh and blood to just be there for him. I wasn't very pleased with the decision at first, but my mother just told me to suck it up, so I did. The first day I arrived, my dad picked me up in his Ford 67 and we drove off. From the start, I could immediately tell that he was really bad off. He was very unkempt, he smelled like sweat and cheap deodorant, and he just gave off the vibe that he had practically hit rock bottom in life. But despite all that, I could tell he was happy to see me. For the rest of the day, we just took it easy. I helped him with some housework, and just got to know each other. Everything was calm as could be until the sun set. That night, as I tucked myself into bed, I heard a sound. It sounded like something scratching against the window, and I also remember a faint, deep, guttural sound. It honestly scared the shit out of me. But I was never a brave kid, so I just pretended it wasn't there and fell asleep after a while. The next morning, I decided to tell my dad about what I heard, to which he replied, it was probably just some coyote or puma. I was pretty sure it wasn't a puma or coyote, but I went with it anyway. The next night, I heard the exact same thing I heard the night before, just louder. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew there was no way that the noise was from an animal, regardless of what it was. I begged my dad to let me sleep somewhere else, but he didn't seem to take me seriously. I guess he just thought I was joking or something. With my nerves practically screaming in fear, I tried to suck it up and sleep that night. But of course, it was back, and louder than ever. That's when I made the bold decision to look outside the window and hopefully, see that my concerns were over nothing. What I saw instead stuck with me permanently. I saw some humanoid creature on hands and knees, scratching at my window. Its body was thin and very lanky, and resembled a human with white skin aside from its head. Its head was the bloody skull of a buck. We even made eye-to-socket contact. I screamed and shut my eyes. I only opened them once I heard my dad running in from his room. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone. Thankfully, my dad started to believe me from this point on. It's been about 40 years since the incident, and I still remember all of it like a nightmare you can never forget. My dad passed away 7 years later, apparently from a breaking and entering gone wrong. I don't think I want to know what they meant by gone wrong. Thankfully, my dad is in a better place now, and I just hope that one day, I'll forget what happened and I'll be at peace too. 10th story. This story was shared by you/AINMeg. The Night Watcher. I am a 28-year-old female, and this is an incident that happened to me last week. I live in a small town, small enough for the map to not even display it. I was always an insomniac and stayed awake till 4 in the morning. Every night at around 2 a.m., I could hear a rustling sound of footsteps in my backyard. Before getting any further, I would like to give an outline of my property. It's a long plot with half of the area covered with big trees and the front half has the building that we live in. Our house is a 3-story building and we have a large backyard. I would come home every summer from my university to spend my vacation with my family. I live with my parents and my younger sister. Every summer vacation, I come to stay for about a month and spend really quality time at home. The days are perfect, but the nights are miserable for me. Every night I would stay awake late and had awful experiences regarding the sounds I mentioned earlier. One day, I decided to confront whoever was making such noise at such late hours of night. I was a fool and decided not to wake my parents up. My room was just beside an open corridor that led straight to the backyard. I still remember it to be a Saturday night. As the clock struck 2, I could hear the rustling noise again. I slowly crept down my bed and opened the door. It made a slight noise and the rustling stopped. I took my phone with me and started walking with my flashlight on. I couldn't see anything at first. As I approached through the darkness, I could see a black figure crouching in the distance, hiding behind an oak tree. I was scared shitless at this point, but something in me told me to keep walking. My reaction was involuntary and I had no control over my body. I slowly approached the figure, which at this point had stood up and I could see its yellow glowing eyes. My phone had stopped working at this point, the battery had died out. Moon was the only source of light I could use to traverse my path. As I was inches away from the figure, it let out a shrieking noise and opened its mouth wide. My eyes had adjusted to the dark and I could see hundreds of razor-sharp teeth protruding from its face. The creature was about 8 feet tall, skinny and covered with a slimy substance all over its body. I was frozen with fear and couldn't move my feet. The creature slowly inched close towards me. It started to make a low growl and a weird hissing noise. It was only inches from my face at this point and I could smell its rotting breath. The creature said in a raspy voice, "Fresh flesh." I immediately came back to my senses, turned back and started running towards my room. It was fast and as I was about to enter my room, it blocked my way. "I am the night watcher," it rasped. I started sobbing at this point. "I want you," it said. I was petrified and just stood there motionless. The creature then jumped over me and bit a chunk from my hand. I was so scared that my voice had died out in my throat. It started to tear off flesh from my legs. I was deeply in pain and slowly, I fainted. I was awoken next morning by my mother. I saw around me and I could understand that I was laying in a hospital bed. The doctors said that I was attacked by an animal and that I had to stay there for about a week. My parents were standing beside me and my mother was in tears. My arms and legs were wrapped in bandages and I couldn't move, as I was in great pain. Today I am writing this post from the hospital. My scars are healing fast and my eyes are turning yellow. My skin is changing texture and has taken a greasy yellow form. The doctors think I have jaundice. I am afraid to go home and mostly afraid that I'm turning into the next night watcher. I hope this post finds someone who knows what I am going through and can help me reverse this transformation. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.